Hi, my name is Ben Levy. I'm with Corepoint Health, and I'm a solution architect here, so I take our products out in the marketplace and implement integration solutions, most of them standards-based, many of them using IHE profiles, and I believe this is one in a whole series of webinars about different IHE profile families, if you will, and I have the simplest one, probably, patient identification management. Okay, so let's move along. So we'll talk a little bit of introductory material here, and then we will talk about the patient ID problem and some IHE solutions, and give you places to get more information.
Ben, this is Selena. If I could interrupt for just one moment. If you could speak up a little bit louder. We had some chat come in saying that that would be helpful.
Okay, is that better?
Sounds good to me. Thank you.
All right, and I apologize. I've been sick over the last week, and so I'm drinking lots of tea here trying to keep my voice up, so I'll see what I can do about hollering into the phone. All right, so we're here to talk about patient identity management, which, you know, it's easy to think that that's an easy problem to solve, right? A patient has an identifier, and that's about the end of it. And it turns out in the real world, it can be very difficult because there are so many people assigning these identifiers to the patients. And you have to manage these patients across these assigning authorities. So it can get difficult. Selena, I should mention I cannot see the chat window, so I'll let you interrupt me if you need to, if there's questions. All right, so IHE has created a number of profiles for patient ID management. There's lots of standards out there, and we've created what we call integration profiles to deal with patient ID management use cases. Some of those integration profiles work within your enterprise. Some of them work across enterprises. And this presentation is focused on two of those, namely PIX V3 and PDQ V3. So what problem is being solved? This is where IHE starts when they develop any integration profiles. It's tell us the use case, and then we'll go out and come up with a solution for those use cases. And our case tonight is to talk about how can we correctly identify and manage patients across boundaries, organizational boundaries, outside your firewall, whatever those boundaries may be, to accommodate the exchange of health information using a standards-based approach with a high degree of assurance that the information is about the correct patient. So if you have John Smith in two different settings, you want to make sure it's the same John Smith you're talking about. And here are the 8 integration profiles that IHE has created to solve different aspects of the patient identification problem. And the first 3 are all flavors of PIX, if you will, patient identifier cross-referencing. There's 3 different flavors of that. And then there's also 3 different flavors of PDQ, or patient demographics query. And then we have a couple at the bottom here. One, the first one being XCPD. This is cross-community patient discovery. And PAM, which is basic patient administration management. So if you think about your patient identification needs in general, it's easy to make a comparison to an eMPI product, if you will, But there's lots of different things you're going to need in your enterprise or your HIE or whatever environment you're working in if you have multiple systems assigning patient identities. And there's several in red here that have been tackled by IHE. On the left there, we have a patient identity feed, and hopefully you'll be able to see my cursor moving here. So we have several different authorities registering patients in different venues of care, and they all feed patient demographics up to this patient identity cloud, if you will, here of functionality. And so that patient identity feed is part of PIX and PDQ that we'll talk about tonight. And then on the other side here, there's a couple of things we want to focus on here, namely the PIX and PDQ services here. So I guess all this is to say that there are many parts to the patient identification puzzle here, and the ones in red are the ones that have been addressed by IHE. So we'll start with PIX, or Patient Identifier Cross-Referencing, the V3 flavor specifically. So the PIX profile supports the cross-referencing of patient identifiers from multiple patient identifier domains. We'll talk about what a patient identifier domain is in just a second. But basically, it's just like we saw on the last slide. There's many people, or I guess it could be many systems or whatever it is that assign identifiers to patients, either throughout your venue of care or across venues of care within an HIE or something along those lines. And PIX gives you a way to cross-reference those together, which will allow you to query them after they are cross-referenced. So we say here that these cross-referenced patient identifiers can then be used by identity consumer systems to correlate information about a single patient from sources that know the patient by different numbers. So System A has John Smith and assigns identifier A to John Smith, and System B has John Smith, but we don't know what the identifier is. So it's hard for us, for the first system to talk to the second system about the same patient because they use different identifiers for those patients. So PIX gives us a way to cross-reference all those identifiers together so that we can kind of get a more longitudinal patient record, if you will. This second bullet is pretty important here. It says this integration profile does not define any specific enterprise policies or cross-referencing algorithms that is outside the scope of the PIX profile. So when you talk about, hey, how do we link these patients together? If I get a feed from System A and it contains, Ben Levy with certain demographics, and my feed from System B also contains Ben Levy with certain demographics, which pieces of demographics do I use to tie those two patients together and claim that they're the same patient? And that is left outside the scope of the PIX profile. That is left up to local negotiation based on local policy. And down here at the bottom, we mentioned our three flavors of PIX. There's one, the original PIX is based on HL7V2. The one used there in Brazil is based on HL7V3. And we have a new one based on FHIR called PIX M, or PIX Mobile. And all those serve an identical purpose, just use a different underlying standard. So PIX is targeted at healthcare enterprises of a broad range of sizes. It could be a hospital, it could be a clinic, it could be a physician office. Again, it could be a collection of hospitals. It could be across a certain region of a country or something along those lines. It supports the cross-referencing of patient identifiers from multiple patient identifier domains via the following interactions. So The first interaction is a transmission of patient identity information from an identity source to the patient identifier cross-reference manager, otherwise known as the PIX Manager. So these are those identity feeds from all those different assigning authorities. The second interaction is the ability to query the PIX Manager via a query response mechanism and say, hey, I work on system A. Here's my identity for John Smith. I want this other identifier for John Smith. And because it's been cross-referenced from the patient identity feeds, the PIX Manager is able to do a lookup and give back the requested identifiers. So we mentioned patient identifier domains, and we have a definition here for you. A patient identifier domain is defined as a single system or a set of interconnected systems that all share a common identification scheme and issuing authority for patient identifiers. So that's really, from my standpoint, I work a lot with HL7V2, but that's, that would be the assigning authority in the PIP3 field if you're a V2 person. A patient identifier cross-reference domain embodies the following assumptions about agreement within the group of individual patient identifier domains. They have agreed to a set of policies that describe how patient identities will be cross-referenced across participating domains. This is what we just talked about a second ago. They have agreed to a set of processes for administering these policies, and they have agreed to an administration authority for managing these processes and policies. So basically all this stuff kind of needs to be talked about in advance of use of the profile. It's, what patient assigning authorities are going to be participating, what patient identifier domains are we going to include, and how are we going to cross-reference these patients together? What do we do when there's issues? How do we handle exceptions, all that kind of stuff. All that policy has to be straightened out in advance. So we have some PIX use cases, and this one here is about multiple identifier domains within an enterprise. So it could be a clinician seeks to monitor data across intensive care and the hospital's laboratory system. So essentially we have two different patient identifier domains, one in the intensive care unit and a different one in the lab. So they likely have the exact same patients, they just use different identifiers to reference those patients. So the hospital ADT system acts as the patient identity source, and that provides a patient identity feed or a PIX feed to the PIX Manager for the laboratory system. And then the intensive care system would need to send a PIX feed to the PIX Manager as well. So that, again, that PIX feed is how the PIX Manager receives all the information about the patients out there in each patient identifier domain. And then as these feeds are received on the PIX Manager cross-references them together in its data store. And then subsequently, any authorized system could use the PIX Manager to determine alternate identifiers, meaning if I was in the intensive care unit on the intensive care system, I could go to the PIX Manager with a query that says, hey, here is my identifier for this patient. I want the identifier for the same patient. I want the different identifier that corresponds to the hospital ADT system assigning authority. Then I can use that identifier to talk to the lab system. So we have our handy-dandy diagram here again, and our three red boxes are where we are focused here. And on the left, we see, again, the patient identity feed portion of the PIX Manager. And just to reiterate, we have our different assigning authorities out here, each one feeding in patient identities into the PIX Manager. And this patient identity feed, it looks like you know, a version 3 ADT feed. The fields within have been constrained by IHE for this profile, but it's basically just an ADT feed. And then on the right we have the PIX query service, which is really the other big half of the PIX profile. So this would receive queries from different systems out there. Presumably these same systems that are on the left, they could query and say, hey, here's my identity for a particular patient. Give me the identity for the same patient in this system, or you know, the yellow system or the blue system, you know, some other system. Pretty simple, right? All right, and here's our PIX V3 Transaction Diagram. And again, we have 3 actors in this profile. We have a patient identity source. We have the patient identifier cross-reference manager, or PIX Manager. And then we have the patient identifier cross-reference consumer, or PIX Consumer. So the patient identity source feeds identities into the PIX Manager, and then various PIX consumers can then query against the PIX Manager. So just a little more about these actors. The patient identifier source provides notification to the PIX Manager for any patient identification related events, including you know, creation, updates, merges, etc. Again, this is basically an ADT feed, so it's registration events, things like that. Patient demographic update events, just probably discharge events, things of that nature. Then we have the patient identity cross-reference consumer, which this actor the cross-reference consumer, this allows a system in a patient identifier domain to determine the identification of a patient in a different patient identifier domain by using that PIX query. And then we have the PIX Manager, which is the PIX Manager is kind of the heart of the PIX profile. Serves a well-defined set of patient identification domains. And based on information provided in each patient identification domain by the patient identification source actor, it manages the cross-referencing of patient identifiers across the different domains, and it answers those queries. All right, and we have a few transactions, IHE transactions related with the PIX profile as well. For V3, the patient identity feed is ITI 44. This is what's used to communicate that patient information. The PIX query is ITI 45, and this is a request on the part of a PIX consumer for an identifier from a different patient ID domain. There's an option to PIX called update notifications, and the PIX update notification transaction is ITI 46. The patient identifier cross-reference manager provides notification of updates to patient identifier cross-reference associations to the different consumers. So with update notifications, you know, typically the patient identification source feeds the information into the PIX Manager, and the PIX Manager does the cross-referencing. There is a use case for a PIX consumer to need to know the other domain's identifier kind of in advance without doing the query. So to accomplish that, they have an option called update notification where the PIX Manager can actually push information about the cross-referencing down to the consumers so that they'll have that on file and they won't have to do a query on the fly to get it. And again, that what we're seeing here is the options to the PIX profile, and that update notification is an option. So if a consumer claims conformance with that option or support for that option, they're really indicating support for that transaction, ITI 46. There's also a pediatric demographics option, and all this does is expand the set of demographics data to include some fields for pediatric patients. So PIX and eMPI are, they're at least related, if not closely related concepts. You might could claim that PIX is kind of a subset of eMPI functionality. It is designed to be compatible with eMPI systems. It does not replace an eMPI, and eMPI will typically do things that beyond the PIX profile, including some proprietary functions. PIX does support a federated and master topology. And, you know, again, a standard HL7 ADT feed could act as the patient identity source actor. And the eMPI query function could act as the patient identifier cross-reference manager actor. So it's, you know, typically when you install an eMPI out of the box, it has a query function. That's one of the purposes of installing an eMPI. And often the eMPI will either support the PIX query or will be pretty close to it. And each actor implementing PIX shall be grouped with the time client actor. The time client actor is part of the consistent time profile. It's another IHE profile used to keep systems, the system date and time of all actors in sync, or fairly closely in sync. And that's, you know, the purpose of that should be pretty self-evident. So we have one slide here about the PIX Manager supporting the XDS Registry. And PIX is a fairly useful component when you're implementing XDS. XDS is cross-reference document cross-enterprise document sharing. And since it operates across the enterprise, those different actors under XDS are often using or often members of different patient identifier domains. So the PIX profile blends nicely with XDS. So we can see the PIX Manager here kind of, I guess what we're showing here is some HIE core services in the middle here. And we have some content consumers at the top and some content creators at the bottom. And what we show here is the content creators contribute content. To do that, they use what's called the affinity domain ID. You could think of it in PIX terms as a master ID across all the different domains. So typically in an XDS environment, before you register content, the first thing you would do is take your local ID for that patient, issue a PIX query to get the XDS affinity domain identifier for that patient. And then you could register your content using that affinity domain identifier. And so, you know, as content is registered with the registry, the global ID, if you will, quote unquote, global ID is used. not the local ID. And of course, the ATNA repository is involved here as well. So all queries are logged to an ATNA repository. Which kind of segues us into PIX Security and Privacy. PIX is paired with the ATNA profile, and we get two things from ATNA in PIX. One is, again, logging of queries for analysis in case there is questions about who accessed what, or problems, or maybe a security breach. And then it also, ATNA provides a mechanism to secure communication between the different actors. That is typically with TLS. And here are some references for the PIX profile. IHE integration profiles, you've probably seen by now that those are released in technical frameworks. And PIX and PDQ both fall under the ITI domain or IT infrastructure domain. So all your references here are in the IT infrastructure technical framework volumes. Volume 1, section 23 there gives you the PIX overview. It'll talk about use cases and things like that. And then in volume 2B is where you'll see the actual transactions listed and expected behaviors and the different data fields, all that kind of stuff. And then at the bottom there in volume 2X, we have some other references as well of about related material. All these technical frameworks are published and available on IHE's website, IHE.net. So Selena, do we have any questions yet?
Hey, this is Selena. I don't have any questions at this time, so why don't we give it a minute here and see if anyone wants to submit any to the Q&A box, the bottom right hand of your screen, or you can chat us as well. Ben or Marcelo, did you get any questions?
If not, I'll move on to PDQ.
Yeah, I have one question for you, Ben. So you mentioned about the file version of the PIX. I'm really interested to know more about how it's going that, and for example, if this profile is, if you know if this profile is part of this coming Connectathon in the USA, or it's still not, it's not approved to be part of that.
It will. I can say it will. It was this past year, this past January. There were some tests for PIX-M, and I think there'll be even, I suspect there'll be even more robust testing this year. It will absolutely be tested at the USA Connectathon.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and you can, at IHE.net, there's all the information you ever wanted to know about PIX-M. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's talk a little bit about PDQ.
Ben, this is Selena. I have one additional come in. Is any provisioning for PIX transitions being encrypted and signaled with a digital certificate?
So the actual communications can be secured with a certificate. That's part of that ATNA profile, ATNA profile. And if you look at the ATNA profile, it talks about TLS, using TLS with mutual certificate authentication. So there'll be a certificate exchange from the server to the client and from the client to the server. So everybody knows who everyone is. And that is rigorously tested at the North American Connectathon. All right, hopefully that answered that question. All right, so let's move on and talk about PDQ. So PDQ is a slightly different use case than PIX. You know, sometimes you want more information than just an ID, right? So PDQ gives you a way to ask a demographic supplier for a list of patients that match certain demographic criteria, and also receive a list of demographics for each matching patient that's returned. You know, just like with PIX, there's 3 versions of PDQ. There's the original PDQ based on HL7 version 2. And then there's PDQ V3, obviously based on HL7 V3. And then there's a new version based on FHIR called PDQ-M or PDQ Mobile. And I believe that is a draft standard right now. I'd have to look on the website to find out, but it is out there. And that one will also be tested at the North American Connect. All right, so PDQ provides a very simple means for querying demographic information based on what you know about a patient. So it could be a partial or complete patient name, perhaps printed on the patient's record or spoken by the patient. It could be the patient ID obtained from a printed barcode or a bedside chart or something like that. It could be partial ID entry or scan. Could be a date of birth or a location, something along those lines. You know a little bit about that patient and you want to know all the patients that match that. One use case is I want to present my user with a PIC list. They'll recognize the patient when they see them. Could be that, hey, I'm in the radiology department of the hospital and I want to query everyone with the last name of Jones, whose current location is radiology. I'll present the user with a PIC list, and they'll recognize which Jones it is, and they'll choose that patient. Something along those lines. And here's a use case related to patient information entering at bedside. So it could be a patient is admitted with partial demographics. A nurse gets to the patient and searches for those partial demographics. And, you know, it could be a complete or incomplete name, could be an ID or a date of birth, whatever it is. System returns that list of patients, and the nurse, maybe even interacting with the patient, the nurse figures out exactly which patient it is and picks them from the list. And I have another use case here. Patient demographics query in an enterprise with multiple patient ID domains. So it could be a laboratory technician seeks to select the correct patient for use by the laboratory software application. So in this instance, the hospital has a patient identifier, and then the lab information system also has its own patient numbering scheme. So you have 2 patient identifier domains going on here. So the lab tech enters basic demographics into the laboratory application. The lab software then uses a PDQ query to query the central facility patient registry for demographics. The lab software also retrieves alternate patient identifiers used by the other software, and the lab tech then selects the proper patient from a list. And at that point, the lab software can update its internal records with any demographics that came down, as well as any identifiers it did not previously know about. So in this instance, it's really again we have our feeds coming in, and in this instance, when we look at our patient identity puzzle here, the PDQ service kind of stands alone. I'm going to answer queries. I'm going to query my data store for matching patients, and I'm going to concoct a list of those patients with limited demographics about them and return those back in response to queries. The actual feeding of the information into the patient demographic supplier is outside the scope of PDQ. It could be part of the PAM profile, it could be part of another IHE profile, or it may not be IHE based at all. So PDQ assumes that the patient demographic supplier is receiving updated demographics somehow. It could be the registration system at the hospital, and it's actually humans entering that information into the system. And then it provides this PDQ query service on the other side. I think we've covered all of that. And here's a transaction diagram, and I apologize the transaction numbers aren't on here, but this is a very basic one transaction profile, if you will. The patient demographics consumer issues a patient demographics query, and the patient demographics supplier receives that query and provides a response. Pretty simple. Actually, if I can go back here, I should mention that this is ITI 47 is the transaction number for this transaction. It's not included in this diagram. So PDQ Actors, there's two of them. There's the patient demographics consumer. The consumer requests a list of patients matching some demographics criteria. And the patient demographic supplier is the other actor. They answer that call and return demographics for all the matching patients. Again, ITI 47 is the only transaction here. That is the patient demographics query. Generally speaking, with IHE, query response transactions, or the query and the response, are included in that one transaction. So this is a request by the consumer to the supplier for information about patients that match certain criteria. And again, the supplier returns the demographic information for the patients that match the criteria. There's a couple of options here. Again, there's a pediatrics option, which again just adds some extra fields on to support pediatric patients. So I don't know enough about Brazil to know if that's applicable to you or not, so that might be worth looking at. The continuation option, you're using the version 3 version, and the continuation option is it's not really an option for V3. It's just part of the V3 messaging. So it allows the patient demographics consumer to say, hey, here's the criteria I want you to search for, and only return me 5 patients at a time. And so the first response comes back with 5 patients, and I display those, and my user says, nope, it's not any of those patients. The consumer can then say, hey, give me the next 5. And the supplier will then respond with the next 5 patients, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of request one screen at a time, if you will. That also prevents the consumer from getting overrun with a very large response if the criteria given in the query are very, very general. So if you said, return me all the patients with the last name of Smith, Jones, and Walker, you know, at least in the U.S., you might get a very, very large number of patients coming back. So the continuation option, it lets the consumer say, here is my query, and this is how many patients I want back with each response. And here we have a PDQ V3 workflow with ITI 47. So we have the patient demographics consumer on the left, the patient demographics supplier on the right. And I included this because it has some of the V3 nomenclature here. That the query is in V3 speak, it is a patient registry find candidates query. and there's the V3 identifier for that, and the response is there as well. And then down at the bottom, you can say, hey, general query, activate query, continue. This is for that continuation option where you've received one or more responses and there's more patients there that you haven't received yet. You can use this general query, activate query, continue message to request the next set of responses. And here we have kind of a list of what someone thought were the important attributes or demographics data points included in PDQ. This is not the complete set. You'll find that in the with the transactions in the Volume 2 information in the technical framework. So again, with security and privacy, this looks a whole lot like PIX because it is a whole lot like PIX. So PDQ, like PIX, is paired with ATNA. And again, this provides logging. So there are audit messages that the actors are should be filing or sending to the ATNA repository about these query events. And again, it also provides for secure transmission here. This is where the actual communications between the actors are secured with TLS, with those certificates. And again, we have some references here. PDQ V3 is final text. It is in the ITI technical frameworks, and the upper level use case type stuff is included in section 24 of volume 1. 3.47 in volume 2B is where you'll find all the technical details about the transactions and you know, which demographics data are included and all that kind of stuff. And then we have some related material there as well in the appendices. And that's about all the material I had here. Here are some links. If you go to IHE.net, you can find all the official IHE material, obviously, including those technical framework documents and other information. IHE has a wiki site as well, wiki.ihe.net, and there are pages there for each committee and implementation notes and ongoing committee work, including current meetings and things of that nature, lots of information there. And then if you wanted to get on the ITI Technical Committee's mailing list, you can go to IHE.net/IT_infrastructure there. And if you scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a link there to check out the Google group associated with the ITI Technical Committee. You can kind of look at some of the content there, and if that's of interest to you, you can get on that mailing list and receive those emails. All right, so let's answer some questions.
Thank you, Ben. Again, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A box on the bottom right hand of your screen, and be happy to answer them. I don't see any pending at this current moment. Marcella or Ben, have you received any to date?
So I have a comment here. So first of all, thank you so much, Ben, for this interesting presentation. So my comment is related to the situation we have right now in Brazil. The DataSUS is the Department of Informatics for Healthcare in the federal government in Brazil. And they implemented a national eMPI system. And currently, we have some PIX PDQ services available for testing in Brazil. So initially, we started to work with PIX PDQv3, but now it seems that also they released something related to V2 version as well. So we as a IHE deployment committee, we have an important contribution in this process. You know, we needed to start to elaborate a national extension for PIX PDQ in Brazil. And my feeling is that this audience is a group that could have a relevant contribution for this process. I know that I have some, I saw the list of attendings, and I could see that we have some colleagues from different companies and also from the government. So Ben, let me make a question for you related to this scenario that I'm describing here. So how do you think we could start a kind of discussion for creating a national extension for a profile like PIX PDQ? So, you know, all the time we are working with volunteers, and so how we could motivate people to be part of this kind of discussion, and so we can at the end have a strong group interested to really providing a collaboration for this process. I know this is a very open question, but I really would like to, I really would appreciate to hear from you some advice or recommendations or suggestions in this direction.
Well, okay, so that was a long question. I'll start where you started and answer that first and say that it was my great pleasure to do this. You know, I think everyone who's participating in this series of webinars is pretty excited to hear that you know, the folks in Brazil are actually picking up these profiles and using them. We are all big believers in standards-based integration and the benefits that come from using those standards. And you know, the more use cases we get and the more people we have at the table, the better and more robust the standards become. So you know, we welcome your participation in any form it takes. And you know, to answer the bigger question, I'd agree with the end of your comments where you said I may not be the best person to be asking that to. That is absolutely the truth. So I would say that when the government says you shall use standards, that's a huge motivator for people to use them. So, you know, I don't know how the government works down there. I know in America, you know, lots of discovery takes place, lots of research, and, you know, there's lots of meetings and talking going on about which standards should be used, you know, how hard is it going to be to implement them and get them, you know, out there and going in the real world. And so it sounds like it's a very exciting and important time for you in Brazil as you, you know, just, you know, on the cusp of implementing these things and making some very important decisions that that hopefully will help you, you know, for years to come potentially. So I'd say when it comes, if your question is, you know, how do we get people kind of fired up to use these standards? I think the answer has many facets, right? And it depends on who you're talking to. For me, using standards means I don't have to do this over and over and over everywhere I go, right? If the national government of Brazil says, hey, we're going to use PIX, then I know if I need to do queries for identifiers anywhere in your country, I'm likely to be able to just pull PIX off the shelf and use it, and it's going to work. And it's going to save all kinds of time and money. And, you know, who doesn't like to save time and money, right? It's important. So So for me, just the savings in time and money and the ease of use is enough for me to be fired up about standards. When it comes to which competing standard you're going to use, that might vary greatly amongst who you talk to. There might be vendors using a competing set of standards who aren't really into IHE, and there might be others who have looked at IHE standards and are very excited about them. So, you know, how you negotiate that kind of thing is definitely beyond my limited scope. Did any of that help?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. So we have other questions here. Selena, do you want to go ahead on the questions?
Sure. We had one person said, great presentation. There's a methodology that can be applied to facilitate and expedite the implementation of IHE profiles.
Oh, wow, that's an excellent question. These are really cross-enterprise profiles, right? So, or at least cross-system profiles. So, I guess I'm afraid I don't have a whole big answer for that question. Though I can say that, at least for me, the Connectathon has been an invaluable resource for my current employer and my previous employer both when investigating, experimenting, and implementing IHE profiles. It's been a really great place to sit down with competitors in a non-competitive environment, and you know, and really, it's an engineering event. So there's no sales going on there. There's no customers there, and it's just engineers hanging around making things work. And so if you know, if IHE Brazil is interested in, you know, if anyone down there is interested in participating in the North American Connectathon, I would highly recommend it. That can really be a big help. Aside from that, your question is probably bigger than I am.
Thanks, Ben. I had someone else comment saying they'd like to know more about Open ePMI. Can you elaborate on that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
It has Open eMPI.
I cannot elaborate on that. I do not know what that is.
Okay. No problem.
eMPI. Yeah, I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah. All right. Those are the questions I have today. Any other ones? Those of you on the phone that want to submit a question, or Marcelo or Ben, anything you'd like to comment or?
Yeah, I would like to another point from my side here. Just I'm curious to know, Ben. So we know that there is some open source code available that we can maybe when we have a company that is starting to understand those concepts that we discussed today, maybe a good way also could be trying to explore some open source available that could be maybe used as a start point for implementation, you know. So there is some, do you have some kind of experience using open source for, or some open eMPI, like the question we read right now? So something like that you could also suggest for us?
You know what, I apologize, I do not. You stumbled upon someone who works for a vendor. So my company develops and markets tools to help with the implementation of integration. Yeah, so open source is fairly outside of my scope.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there is a question in Portuguese here. Let me translate it for you, Ben. So the question is related to some EMR companies, EMR vendors like Epic, Cerner, and others, and how those vendors are using PIX PDQ, or if they are implementing it, if PIX PDQ is being used for other vendors in the U.S.
Yes. So I see PIX PDQ being used in the marketplace here in the U.S., and I see it used again as part of, especially PIX, as part of the XDS profile. So in this country, the government has something going on called meaningful use, and if you make meaningful use of medical record software, then the government gives you certain incentives around that as far as reimbursement and such. And part of meaningful use requirements is transmission and reception of CCD documents using XDS. So PIX is because it's part of government regulations. PIX is seeing a lot more use than it used to. XDS as well, actually. So, yeah, we do see that out in the marketplace, and sometimes it's used inside a hospital to solve some local issue with an older system, maybe something along those lines. Other times it's used when someone's dealing with an HIE as part of XDS. I believe I've also seen it used in conjunction with just reporting to the government for population health type use case.
I see. Thank you. Any other questions? Professor Renato Sabatini, Rodrigo Gaete, Paulo.
So, Marcelo, I'd say that if, going forward, if people have questions, you have my email address. You're welcome to email me anytime. If I don't know the answer, I will hopefully refer you to someone who can help you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, just a final comment from my side, Selena. I would like to thank HIMSS for organizing this event and all support that you are providing for us in this organization. Thank you so much. Also, I would like to thank you, Ben, for accepting this invite to be with us today. It was a great presentation. Congrats for this introduction. And I would like to say thank for this audience as well, because we are working for creating a strong group in Brazil, and I would invite you that to visit our website, www.ihet.org.br. So please, if you did not access our website, please go there and enter subscribe for our email distribution list, so you could be updated about the events that we are providing and planning for this year. One of them that I would like to mention for you today is the symposium of IHE, the IHE symposium that we are planning for the Brazilian Congress of Health Informatics on November. So plan to be there with us. It will be a great opportunity also to hear other experts like Ben explaining and giving some ideas about how to use IHE and also clarifying some technical points related to the profiles itself. So thank you so much for your attention. And also on this coming Thursday, we will have another webinar. At that time, we will speak about XDSB. So we mentioned it yesterday during the introduction. Also today, and I have mentioned something about that. And on this coming Thursday, our intention is giving an introduction about the XDSB profile and the concepts behind that, the concepts behind the document sharing proposition. So it would be also very interesting. Again, Ben, thank you so much for your support, and thank you for this audience today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank everyone for joining. A very good lecture and presentation by Ben and Marcelo. Thank you for hosting us. So everyone have a good evening, and we will put this recording on IHE.net, and that will conclude our webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention.